Let me read to you a passage from the 4th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 24 to 30. It's the Gospel for Monday of the 3rd week of Lent. St. Luke writes, Jesus said, I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him down the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. That's from Luke chapter 4, verses 24 to 30. It speaks to us of the attachment to sin. What do I mean? Well, you know, there has been archaeological work done on the settlement of Nazareth, as it was in the general era of Jesus of Nazareth. The village had a history, together with lapses in settlement, it seems. I'm not aware of any reference to Nazareth in ancient records or inscriptions outside of its connection with Christ. The much discussed Nazareth inscription was almost certainly occasioned by talk of Christ's resurrection. There is no doubt that Jesus of Nazareth gave the village a renown that will last till the end of time. Christ was its greatest son, one who had no peer, and outside of him, Nazareth would have remained nothing to speak of. It would have become one of the countless forgotten villages of history, or if by force of circumstances it had grown as it has in population, it would have had no special significance apart from Christ. On being told by Philip that the Messiah was in their midst and that he was Jesus of Nazareth, Nathanael asked, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" John chapter 1 verse 46. In the Gospel of St. Luke, our Lord returns to his home village after the commencement of his public ministry. We are not told when it is, although Luke places it early. It is to be noted that Mark speaks of a return of our Lord to Nazareth, chapter 6 verses 1 to 6, but there is no mention of an expulsion, an attempt on his life. So there may have been more than one visit, and Luke's account may combine at least 2 visits, with the second one including all the drama. So then, Luke writes that Jesus returned to Galilee after his baptism and temptations in the wilderness, and began to preach in the synagogues. Then we read, he came back to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and he went into the synagogue there, as his custom was, on the Sabbath day. The whole episode is given some 16 verses by St. Luke, and the upshot of the visit, or visits, home was remarkable. I find it difficult to imagine that there was any direct parallel in the village's entire history. Our Lord went into the synagogue, where he had been going for some 30 years, among clan members and fellow townsmen, and said his piece, declaring that he was the promised Messiah. He warned the congregation that the test ahead of them was one of faith, and that they were unlikely to pass the test. The upshot was that he would have been lynched were it not for his command of his own situation. They rose up, angrily confronted him, and not content with throwing him out of the synagogue, they hustled him ahead of them to a local precipice. There they would have killed him had they been able to. But, we read, he passed through the midst of them and went on his way, making Capernaum his base thereafter. I doubt that there had been a similar instance of this in the village's history. It took the revelation of who Jesus really was to bring their true colours to light. It is an amazing incident, and it bore out the truth of Nathanael's passing observation. Can any good come from Nazareth? However, much good did come from it. It contained the holiest trio in all of human history: Jesus himself, Mary his mother, and Joseph his foster father. There is some evidence to think that among our Lord's apostles and disciples were some relatives. Some of these may have come from Nazareth. So, as with the scribes, the Pharisees, and the leaders of the people, there would have been some at Nazareth who responded in faith. But this terrible reaction on the part of his own was yet another instance of what St. John states in the prologue of his Gospel, that the Word made flesh came unto his own, and his own did not receive him. It is this which, more than anything, reveals the evil and the power of sin. There are various ways of appreciating the evil of sin. We can think of its terrible effects on the moral constitution of man. Sin corrupts him and brings about a collapse of his moral life. We can think of its effects on the entire history of man. The book of Genesis describes the entry of sin into the world at the beginning, and the rest of the Old Testament describes the story of sin and death flowing from it. We can think of its effects on man's eternal lot. It results in damnation forever if it is serious, unrepented sin. Or most of all, we can contemplate the effect of man's sin on Jesus Christ. He who was utterly sinless was made to suffer indescribably. Christ's rejection by the people of Nazareth was one of several instances of this described in the Gospel. Its final sequel would be the crucifixion. Christ stood there in the synagogue before his own townsmen, revealing who he was and the good things he would do for them. He warned them of their pride. They must be on guard against the temptation not to believe. Two things stand out in our gospel scene: the love of Christ in revealing himself to them, and their great sin in rejecting this revelation and this love. Especially does our passage reveal to us what sin can lead to, and this sin lies within each one of us. Christ warned his townspeople against the sin of non-belief. Let us take heed of his warning. Indeed, let us consider it a warning against all deliberate sin. Lent is the time of turning away from sin, whether mortal or venial. We must be on guard against any conscious attachment to sin. We may be attached to holding on to unnecessary wealth when in the face of the poverty of others. We may be attached to harbouring resentments and to the refusal to forgive. We may be attached to sloth. Whatever sins we are secretly holding on to must be renounced. Let us then take our stand with Jesus and make him our great means of combating sin and living for God.